We've got a lot of ways to play retro games these days, whether it be through emulation, clone consoles, or a multitude of ways to prop up and modernize original hardware. There's plenty to choose from, which is great. But with all of those solutions, it might be easy to forget that millions of us already have a fantastic machine with a massive retro game library right now in our living rooms, the PS5. PlayStation consoles have always been pretty good about having retro games available, but the PS5 might just be the best of them all. Most PS5 owners are aware that you get access to a bunch of retro titles with a subscription to PlayStation Plus Premium. But what a lot of people haven't realized is that you can actually buy several of these one by one, no subscription needed. And what's even better, if you've been around the PlayStation ecosystem for a while, you might already be entitled to some of them, as purchases from the PS3 and Vita stores count on some of them. This seems to be on a case-by-case basis, but the original 3 Siphon Filter games are apparently included in that. Pretty neat. And they also have trophy support and some nice features via the PS5's fancy new PS1 emulator. You got save states and some nice video filters, and a rewind feature for when this happens. Siphon Filter is a third-person action shooter about Gabe Logan and his partner,
Leon,
as they hunt down terrorists, defuse bombs, and inexplicably roll through glass doors. The story is no Metal Gear Solid, but it gets the job done. Gabe is pretty generic, even for the time, but I like him enough. Leon Zing actually becomes more interesting than Gabe throughout the story, and Sony Bend seems to have understood that because they make her a bigger part of the story in each game. Shooting and movement feel pretty good in these games overall, with it getting noticeably better in 3, but largely playing the same throughout the trilogy.
I've taken out Grafx and destroyed the comm equipment.
There's a pretty decent assortment of weapons with auto-lock and more precise aiming options if you want to go for headshots, which the game really wants you to know you can do. The weapon variety here is pretty great, with some cool sniper rifles, a shotgun with ridiculous range, and my personal favorite, the M79, which I still enjoy just as much as I ever did. You also have infinite shots with the legendary taser that will end all enemies without a flak jacket, and even make them burst into flames, which is kind of deranged, but I enjoy it. Siphon Filter's level design feels pretty ahead of its time, with open-ended layouts and multiple objectives that change based on what happens in the story. Sometimes you'll focus on stealth, rescuing hostages, taking out certain targets, and other stuff.
Leon, tell CBDC Command that I freed the hostages.
Combine all of that with some above-average shooting, and you get a pretty great game here that holds up well, and gives you lots of excuses to do all kinds of Siphon Filter stuff. Now, like with any PS1 game, you do kind of have to get yourself into the right mindset for the controls. And in Siphon Filter's case, it's tanky movement, strafing with shoulder buttons, and selecting weapons with this slow-ass menu. There's no way to modify the controls on the PS5, sadly, but again, it's not too hard to get used to, especially if you played these games back in the day when this was normal. You just gotta dust off that part of your brain. And if you're too young to know what this was like, then you probably aren't watching my videos anyway, so go to hell, I guess. Siphon Filter games overall are pretty great. They're not the only third-person shooters on the PS1 by any stretch, though. I'd really like to see some of the more arcadey ones, like 1 or C12, make it on the PS5 eventually.
That would be cool.
Clockwork Aquario was developed back in the early 90s by Weststone, but shelved at the last minute due to some bad initial feedback from testers, and Sega wanting to focus more on 3D games. 2 decades later, the good folks at Strictly Limited Games would get the rights, port it to modern consoles, and here we are. The game has a pretty appealing mix of ideas from other great 2D platformers of the time. It has an attitude vaguely reminiscent of Sonic games, a pick-up-and-throw kind of combat like the Bubble Bobble games, and controls and short-range attacks that kind of remind me of High Seas Havoc. You can even bonk enemies from underneath, like this guy. So as a guy who loves all of those games, I like to see these elements together in one thing. Although I don't think Clockwork Aquario really lives up to any of those inspirations, it's not bad. Bopping multiple enemies on the head in succession results in high scores. The general gameplay feels pretty good, with a lot of platforming sections being approachable in different ways, and enemies and bosses being generally satisfying to take out. Sadly, a lot of that is dragged down a little bit by characters that are so big, which looks nice but also means it'll get annoying trying to avoid getting hit with such limited screen space to operate in. And that's really my only major complaint, as the level variety, designs, and music are all above average. So it's a shame that the moment-to-moment gameplay is dragged down a little bit by the zoomed-in design choice. The game has a surprisingly deep set of visual enhancements and filters to look through and tweak to your liking, or just ignore. Clockwork Aquario is an interesting game, and I'm glad that Strictly Limited was able to get it out into the wild. It doesn't click with me as much as I was hoping, but you could certainly do worse in the genre. Hey, if it looks interesting to you, pick it up. Armed F is a very challenging vertical shooter that saw a couple of ports, I think, but I discovered it on the PC Engine while blindly meandering around eBay, and it quickly became one of my favorite shooters on the system. Hard as all hell, though. Here on the PS5, we get the arcade version, though, via the Arcade Archives series, which has brought a lot of great arcade games to PSN. Now, they don't have their own section on the PSN store, but if you put ACA in the search bar, you'll basically get them all in one big list, and it is a big list. From the ones I've played so far, Armed F is one of the toughest retro shooters you can get on the PS5, and I really like it. Controls are pretty basic with shooting, which I highly recommend turning the rapid fire on, by the way, and a special move, which instead of being a bomb or something like that, it just appears to let you move your satellites for a little while. This can be anything from pointless to extremely useful depending on how you've got your satellites set up. If you've got your weapons upgraded, then you can give your fire a lot more spread. Other than that, though, you're basically on your own, and you'll get slapped around a lot until you get your bearings, and then you'll get slapped around some more. This game has some pretty nice graphics for the time, and while I think I slightly prefer them on the PC Engine version, this is still a really cool looking shooter. There's a lot of biomechanical imagery like a lot of shooters had at the time, but this game gives it a slightly more psychedelic twist with lots of purples and blues and other colors that you don't often see used in this way in the genre. The music is fittingly strange, and sometimes even a little bit catchy, but not super memorable. But it does fit the game pretty well, and that counts for a lot in my book. Like I mentioned, though, the game is tough, and that's its main characteristic to me. No matter how powerful you are at any time, it's a one-hit death shooter. It's also a get taken back to a checkpoint with all of your weapons and upgrades removed shooter. It doesn't get much more punishing than this, but it also doesn't get a lot more satisfying either, with fun bosses and lengthy levels to overcome. If you've got the stomach for it. There's a lot of great retro shmups in the Arcade Archive series, so feel free to explore, but I highly recommend this one in particular, especially if you want something a little weird and a little bit different. The Pursuit Force games flew way under my radar back in the day, and I have no idea why. Had I known about this game when I had a PSP, I would have absolutely loved it. But thanks to the PS5's PSP Classics catalog, it's now purchasable and playable on a modern home console, with trophies and filters and all that jazz, which is awesome. Here you control a member of an elite law enforcement unit that takes down dangerous gangs, and for whatever reason, that typically involves long, sprawling car chases, commandeering enemy vehicles, and destroying them, and just making a complete mess of the highway. If you've ever played those Time Crisis games in an arcade, this has a pretty similar vibe. Can't recommend this game enough. As you take out enemies and accomplish objectives, you fill up the justice meter, which can repair your current vehicle, increase your damage, or do other things depending on the situation.
Looks like I underestimated these scumbags.
You also have unlockable cheats in the game, but you're better off waiting until you've beaten the game to use them because the game won't let you progress if they're activated, which I guess makes sense. Now, the PSP library on PS5 is quite small at the moment, but I think it's a huge step in the right direction for PlayStation. The more PSP games they want to bring over, the better. If you want to see more of this sort of thing, get on PSN and buy some of these classic games. Let them know you like it. PlayStation might put blue stuff all over the place, but I promise you the color they like the most is green. here's another one I totally missed out on in its heyday, Doom 64. Now, I was introduced to Doom on the PS1, and I played the hell out of those games. And while I knew about Doom 64, and I even had a couple of friends that had it, I just didn't really give it much thought. It looked insanely dark, which was kind of off-putting, and I hated the N64 controller. Still do, and I just kind of forgot about Doom 64. But now that we live in the future, we can play Doom 64 on the PS5 with a good controller, and cheats, and extra levels, and that darkness problem seemingly fixed up. So now that I've put some time into it, I can confidently say that Doom 64 is another great classic Doom game. Stands right alongside the originals. There's no looking up or down, there's no jumping, and no crouching, just good old-fashioned strafing, running, and shooting. It's got some cool-looking new versions of the weapons and enemies that made the original Doom games so great, and a plethora of cheats that create insane replayability, as well as a lot of bonus levels that I'm pretty sure were not in the original version. There's also a nice FOV slider that you don't see every day on consoles, so I highly recommend turning that up a little bit. Now, Doom 64 leans into the horror vibe a bit more than the Dooms before it, and I think that benefits it tremendously. The MIDI thrash music of the originals is gone in favor of just kind of ominous tones and enemies snarling in the distance. There's also a lot more gore and viscera in this one too, which is all the more shocking considering that it was made for a Nintendo system. Again, I think that benefits it though and makes it stand out a little bit more. It's fast, it's violent, it's kinda spooky, and it's also got one of the best shotguns of all time. It's also on sale digitally pretty often, so shouldn't be too hard to grab it for $5 or so with a little patience. The Sen Goku games are also playable on PS5, and they're pretty bizarre. I've only got the second one for whatever reason, so that's the one I'm gonna talk about today. At its core, it's pretty basic 2D hack-and-slash beat-em-up fare. You got your heavy and light attacks, special moves, jumping, and blocking. You've also got tons of enemies that do repeat a little bit for my taste, but it's not horrible. You can also switch between the different characters at any time, and boy, are they vastly different from one another. Most situations seem better suited for the basic sword guy, but sometimes the big lumbering dude with the staff works pretty good. And sometimes the ninja works well, and I'm not sure when the dog is supposed to be useful, but he's there. Sen Goku's gameplay might sound a bit generic, and it kind of is, but the real draw for me is just getting to see what insane levels and bosses are coming up next. One minute you're on horseback fighting demon samurai, and the next you're on a warplane in World War II. And then you're fighting whatever the hell this is. Why not? The whole game seems to embrace being a mishmash of nonsense at every turn, and I dig it. The gameplay doesn't quite back it up in my opinion, as the novelty tends to wear off in about 20 minutes or so, but it's certainly worth a play for fans of these types of games. And you also have 2 players, so that's a plus. Even though I do get bored with Sen Goku 2 after a short while, I do find myself coming back to it every now and then for the wackiness alone. I've heard Sen Goku 3 is even better, so hey, maybe there's more to these games than I realize, but at the very least, I can say that this one definitely stands out. Ultracore is one of those games that went unfinished for a very long time and got finished up and released in the modern age. This game absolutely oozes Sega Genesis or 32X vibes, and I love it for that. The side-scrolling shooting is pretty fun and pretty frenetic at times, with lots of enemies zipping around the screen and you just doing your best to keep them at bay. Kinda reminds me of Turrican, but with better hit detection. You'll be shooting almost constantly trying to keep from getting overwhelmed. Ultracore tries to give you the ability to aim your shooting up and down to really pinpoint your fire, but I find it to be kind of finicky and slow, especially in chaotic moments where you're shooting tons of stuff all over the place. Seems to me you're probably better off just jumping around while firing most of the time. Outside of that, combat's pretty tight. You get a few different weapons to choose from, with upgrades that all run out of ammo eventually, so it's usually best to save the good stuff for bosses. Movement feels pretty good, if not a little bit bouncy. Sometimes the knockback from getting hit feels overly harsh, and results in more cheap deaths than I would like. like the control overall though. I also dig the level designs that really make you learn the level with lots of doors that need keys or switches to be flipped to unlock them. So you'll be crawling all over the levels to advance as opposed to just going from left to right, which keeps things pretty spicy. Though it is easy to get disoriented if you're not paying attention because most of the levels look very similar all the way through. Now the music is outstanding. This definitely would not have worked on a Genesis cartridge. So I guess because of that, I'm kind of glad it took 30 years to be finished. Now some repetition will set in with the levels and enemies starting to blur together before too long. So because of that, I think I recommend it, but only in short bursts. If you do it that way, Ultracore is a great time, and if you like games like Gunstar Heroes and Contra, I think it's worth picking up, definitely if you find it on sale. Now this game gets a lot of hate, and you know what? I get it. Now, I don't think the Immortal is so bad that it deserves the 20-minute uncut screed that James Rolfe unleashed on it a few years back. But I mean, it's easy to see why it doesn't jive with a lot of people. It's cryptic as all hell, it doesn't control particularly well, and it's absolutely littered with instant death traps that are barely telegraphed, if at all. So this trial and error aspect of the game is often cited as its biggest flaw, and I think I agree with that. But I don't think it necessarily ruins the game. Especially now, thanks to Qbyte and Pico, we can play it on the PS5 with save states which, if used liberally, can mitigate that issue dramatically. Still, the Immortal is a tough dungeon crawler that never really explains itself and has an extremely steep learning curve, so it's not for everybody. Hell, it's not for most people, but still, I like this game. The spooky vibe and surprising amount of gory deaths make it really interesting to me. There's also just some indescribable element of it that appeals to me. I don't know if it's just the general vibe or what, but I like it. Once you get your arms around the combat, it's actually kind of fun. You fight lots of these goblin dudes and other enemies, but the strategy is generally the same. You dodge their attacks until they wear themselves out, and then go in with a flurry of slashes from the opposite direction that they're attacking from. Once this meter maxes out and their attacks slow down, that's your time to shine, and you can go in and hack them down like an oak tree. And if you do it right, you'll be rewarded with a traumatizing death animation that you definitely would not have seen on anything but the Sega Genesis at the time. As for the puzzles and the traps, which make up about 60% of the game, yeah, it's mostly trial and error. Sometimes the game gives you super vague hints as to what to expect, but for the most part, you're just thrown to the wolves. But if you don't mind referring to a guide every now and then and making liberal use of those save states, there's some good sick fun to be had with the Immortal. The NES version and the 16-bit Genesis version are essentially the same as far as I can tell, but of course the 16-bit version is the way to go. It's more over the top and just seems to do its own ideas more justice. As always, Qbyte has a few filters to play with here, and they're surprisingly good. The CRT one is a bit exaggerated perhaps, but it looks convincing. Still, I prefer the smooth option most of the time. The Immortal isn't what I would call a particularly pretty game either, with lots of drab grays and browns throughout the many dungeony levels, but at the same time, that's the idea of the game, so I'm not really sure what else it could look like. And it does have some strong points, with detailed character designs and impressive animations here and there. Plus, the spooky soundtrack goes a long way. I genuinely love a lot of the music here, and I think it fits the game perfectly. So again, I won't blame you for counting this one out for its ridiculously obtuse gameplay, but there are some nuggets of fun buried just beneath that for those that have the patience to stick with it. Ninja Spirit is now officially the most talked about game on my channel, and I can't promise this will be the last time, but I've never talked about this particular version. PSN has a direct port of the original arcade version of Ninja Spirit, and it plays almost exactly like its PC Engine and TurboGrafx counterpart. Massive leaping, great music, and a constant avalanche of enemies flowing towards you at all times. Here though it is one-hit death, so it's a little bit harder than on the Turbo. Every other aspect of it plays about the same though. You bob and weave around levels, collect power-ups and other spirits to follow you and multiply your attacks. And using them to your advantage is the key. Being maxed out with everything makes combat a lot smoother, but in this game, all it takes is one little mistake and it's all gone. And like a lot of classic arcade games, starting off in the middle of a level without any power-ups is a tough time. And here it's nearly impossible to claw your way back to where you were, especially in later levels. Ninja Spirit gets my stamp of approval once again. The giant leaping and unique weapons make it really fun even today. And there's not much out there that really plays quite like it. Ultimately, I think I still prefer the TurboGrafx version. The colors and the contrast are a lot better there, and this version looks kind of washed out in comparison. I also prefer having multiple hit points over being on the verge of death at all times, but I might slightly prefer the music of the arcade version, so I don't know, both are great at the end of the day. If you're a fan of this game or other games like it, I think it's worth picking up on the PS5 or 4. It's very unique, it's easy to jump into, and it's difficult to master, and those are all things that you want in a game like this. So there's just a handful of the hundreds of retro games that you can legally play right now on your PS5, and in most cases your PS4. And I know that's just barely scratching the surface, so be sure to let me know about any other obscure or must-play retro games on PSN that I might have missed, and maybe I'll cover those later on. But until then, thanks for watching.